see the sign and realize your sin.
Emerson, Lake and Palmer, sometimes known as ELP to their friends, were a progressive rock supergroup with Keith Emerson, who'd come from a band called The Nice, Greg Lake, who'd come from a band called King Crimson, that some people have heard of, and Carl Palmer, who'd come from The Crazy World of Arthur Brown and Atomic Rooster. They were effectively active for the 1970s, with several reincarnations and reimaginings since then. So Palmer played drums, Lake played bass and guitars, and Emerson played keyboards, mostly a hammered organ, but synths and all sorts of keyboards he could get his hands on. This effectively means that for a lot of their music, there were a trio of bass, drums, and organ, with Greg Lake also singing at times. So their most recognisable sound is organ-led complexity. They have been known to use guitars at various points, but they've definitely got a keyboard focus. They were also particularly influenced by classical music, and applying classical styles to much of their music and adapting classical classics, so things written by classical composers, into a kind of mixture between classical and rock. As with many progressive rock bands, what they did had a tendency towards being complex and very musically accomplished. Possibly more than any other band, they came under attack in the late 70s for being pompous and pretentious. And often they do feel like they were a vehicle, particularly for Keith Emerson to show off. I think Keith Emerson's fingers must have had some kind of speed-up, power-up to them, because he was an absolutely incredible keyboard player from quite a young age. My name's Dan. So this was the second studio album by ELP, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and it's my second time reviewing it. But those of you who've been with me for a while will know that I'm fairly often at the moment seem to be saying, because I reviewed it on my blog. No, not in this case, because before I had my blog, so before videos there was blogs. Before blogs there was Facebook, and I reviewed prog rock albums on Facebook for a couple of years. Which I then turned into a kind of a book. It's not been published; it's just for my own fun. But there we are. It was a book called Prognostic. Anyway, this got reviewed by me, so this was quite a few years ago for that. On paper, I should like ELP, but actually, they're not one of my favourite prog bands. They're one of those bands that I kind of go, I like it in principle, but actually in practice, there are times when there are things that they do that I'm less keen on. So apparently this album nearly caused the breakup of the band. So they were branching into more complex stuff, and Greg Lake was not impressed. So what happened? So we got Carl Palmer on the drums and Keith Emerson on the keyboards, and Carl Palmer had been practicing stuff, some quite complex stuff, and Keith Emerson had been doing some practice and stuff, quite complex stuff, on the keyboard. And then Keith Emerson found that his stuff fitted with the stuff that Carl Palmer was doing. And then so kind of produced this idea to the band in the studio. And apparently Greg Lake wasn't so keen, but they managed to persuade him to stay. So we've got here keys. That's Keith Emerson. Mostly rock organ, but there are some others, including piano and a church organ and one. And we've got bass, which is Greg Lake, and Carl Palmer on the drums, and then lyrics by Greg Lake and singing by Greg Lake. First side is one long sweet song, and apparently, when I say sweet, I mean several bits put together rather than it's sugary. And it's complex. Apparently, it's one of the first tracks that worked like this. I can think of a few that were earlier than this, but I'm not going to bother right now. So lots of changes of section. The lyrics are vague, but apparently they're the story of Tarkus, and Tarkus is the armadillo tank hybrid who appears on the cover of the album. The second side is all shorter songs, which is quite varied. So there's a couple of comic songs. So Procol Harum pioneered, to my mind anyway, the inclusion of these kind of things in kind of proto-prog stuff they were doing a few years earlier. They'd usually have one or two that kind of feel like music hall-y kind of stuff. So I like this too. Jeremy Bender is dated in its humour, I have to say. His feel is kind of Beatles-esque story song with honky tonk piano, and it does, I'd say, hark back a bit to music hall, but it feels more Beatles than music hall to me. And Are You Ready, Eddie is a kind of rock and roll track with some interestingly nonsensical lyrics going on. There's some fantasy-like tracks. There's at least one I think that's instrumental in here as well. And I want to talk about The Only Way brackets hymn. So musically, this is backed first by church organ and then by jazz classical style piano. Well, it's like classical style piano with jazz style drums going on. It's it's slightly controversial because it's distinctly anti-Christian and humanist. But this is Greg Lake writing the lyrics, and Greg Lake occasionally did that. So one of his best known tracks is Do You Believe in Santa Claus? I can't remember what the name of it is. It's his Christmas song, which is strongly anti-Christian as well. The the pair of lines here that was nearly vetoed by the other two in the band are can you believe God makes you breathe? Why did he lose 6 million Jews? Which comes shortly after singing the line you've got to believe in people or human beings or something like that. So I get the question. It's a common question, which is why does God allow suffering? But I do object to these lines myself, and I'm not quick to object to such things. The reason why I object is because I don't think it's fair. Because who killed 6 million Jews? It was people. And in a strongly humanist song, it's a strange thing to bring out as an example of why God's bad and not an example of why people are bad. Anyway, I'm going to move on from that because I've done it. So for me, that little bit is too bitterly prejudicial. The rest of that track is a bit so. The rest of the album, though, I don't have problems with in that sense. Musically, it's complex and interesting. At times, it's a bit too show-offy. It's a bit too much. Look how many fingers I've got from Keith Emerson. He is a very, very good player. But I think probably one of the reasons that I am less keen on ELP in general is because they seem to be too much of a vehicle for Keith Emerson to show off how much he can play. Again, this is prog rock, and showing off is what prog rock is about generally. So maybe I should cut him more slack than that. There is some good playing. To be honest, there's some amazing playing in this album, but it didn't really light me up. It's maybe too technical and not any feel as well. Maybe. Anyway, that's what I think of this album. I might have upset some people because I know it's a very beloved album by some prog heads. But as I always do at this point, I'd like to invite you to tell me what you think of this album. So please will you do that by leaving me a comment. And that's it from me for now.
People are still